So really, scientific publication hasn't changed a whole lot throughout the years. Yeah, we're reading more papers electronically. We're not going down to the library stacks to do as much research anymore, or maybe you haven't done that at all. But the general look of what these papers look like is pretty much the same as it has been for many years. The figures are carefully crafted. The text is written in a way to sort of expose you to what the ideas being presented are, what considerations were taken into account, what the discussion of certain issues is. And you have figures that stand there sort of trying to communicate pieces of what the results have shown. But as a reader or a reviewer, you can't really do much with that paper. You can look at it, you can examine it, you can think about it, but you can't interact with it very much. And furthermore, if you just think about recreating or regenerating a figure that you had in one of your papers from maybe 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, maybe 2 months ago, think about that a little bit. How would you go back and do that? Are you on a new machine? Do you still have the input data that you used or the input parameters that you used for a simulation? Do you know what software you use? Can you still install that software on either your local machine or the supercomputers you used? Maybe you can't do that, but can you recreate the workflow or the script, the higher level idea of what happened, and sort of go in and fill in the pieces that need to be updated? Do you remember all the parameters that you set, right? Maybe some of them you recorded, maybe some of them are encoded in the file name, but what's there? So if you think about this, there's a lot more below the surface of the paper, right? There's not just the figures, but what went into those figures, the workflows, the source code, the libraries, the machine information where you ran it on. All of these things sort of sit beneath the surface of scientific publications. And so, often when we're asked, can you reproduce this? We say, yes, but don't ask me to unless you really want me to do it, because it's probably not going to be that straightforward. Sometimes our code is like a Rube Goldberg machine, right? You can see it looks great when it runs perfectly, but every once in a while something goes a little wrong and you have to step in and tweak something. And keeping track of all of those pieces, knowing exactly how they work, what follows which, is something that is important here. And it sort of translates to what we publish and what we deal with scientific results. So in terms of reproducibility, Aaron mentioned that this morning. We want to capture the code that was used, what the results that were achieved were, and it includes a lot of different items. But I'd argue that having reproducible experiments, reproducible code is something that improves community collaboration and sharing. And this has been alluded to earlier. Furthermore, on sort of the idea of making sure things work is we want to ensure the quality or reliability and trustworthiness of our results, right? We don't want to put out a Pentium chip that has a division bug that somebody may happen upon in the future. And there are other examples of this. One you may have heard of fairly recently in the area of political science is a story that made headlines at the end of last year. Political science studies sort of went out and examined people's views on same-sex marriage. And they looked at those views before and after somebody sort of went to a house and interviewed or sort of told somebody about the issue, tried to educate them. And what they found, what the study showed in the results and in the plot here, is that if a gay canvasser went to a house, there was sort of a significant jump in the support for same-sex marriage. Right? And this is a fairly interesting result. This is something that got picked up by the New York Times. There was a This American Life story on NPR that sort of talked about this, and some of the interesting things by the personal contact sort of seemed to make a big impact in how people viewed a specific issue. And so this, it's a very interesting result. And so some grad students who I believe were then at UC Berkeley looked at this result and they said, well, we can extend this a little bit. We can do more than what was here, try to take this initial study and look at some other aspects. And they did their own pilot study. They looked and tried to get the similar results, and they just couldn't get the same results. And they tried to look into how the canvassing was done, what sort of firm was used. They couldn't quite put everything together. And as they looked around, they found some published data that actually kind of matched what the results that were reported were, right? These histograms are from different, purportedly different studies, but they really match up on sort of a finely detailed histogram. And so they sort of thought, what's going on here? And you know, there's a whole sort of soap opera that goes along with this story that if you want, you can read about, but I don't really want to dwell on those aspects, okay? What's interesting is even at the end of their paper that they sort of published sort of what they found and what they're sort of questioning, these grad students and another collaborator listed some remaining uncertainties. And what they noted there were things like, you know, we don't have access to the data that was on this website, so we can't really evaluate some of these other similarities. Or, you know, this other data from another paper is not currently publicly available. We can't look at the data. We don't know how it was there. But they did bring these irregularities up to one of the paper's co-authors, and after he reviewed them and talked to the other author and had some other contact, he actually requested retraction of this article fairly quickly. Science acted upon it, I think, in like 8 to 9 days. They posted a retraction online. But in this letter, there's some interesting pieces. It says, you know, the survey data could not be traced back to the original Qualtrics source files. And further, it says the failure to produce the raw data undermines the credibility of the findings, right? So some of these things, being able to trace back the data, understand where things came from, are important, right? And this is one of the things that, you know, the science editors and others looked at when they decided to retract the paper and said, we can't, you know, regardless of, you know, what may have been done, based on what's there, we can't substantiate it as, you know, the correct results. And so these negative results are something that people love to throw out in the world of provenance or sort of reproducibility, right? You don't want to be the one caught. You don't want to be the one who, you know, somebody comes to when you're a professor or you're a grad student and says, I really need this to, you know, to show me how this works. And you go back and you can't do it. You can't reproduce it. And you're like, oh no, this is no good. I'm going to get papers retracted and all kinds of horrible things, right? But I do want to suggest that provenance is important for positive reasons as well, right? And this was alluded to with reproducibility as well, but we can reuse past work, right? If we know what was done, if the authors in the study that I referenced had access to some of the previous survey data and could look at things, they could maybe make better decisions about where to go next. They could reuse the past work. So here's a picture of Petco Field. They reused part of the building, right? The same thing can be done in scientific study. So here's an example of looking at workflows, which we heard about this afternoon. Can we sort of take workflows or provenance of workflows and try to gain some understanding of what common things people do with workflows, in this case, visualization workflows. And another piece, sort of on the positive side, again, is looking at exploration and learning, right? So if you look at Lewis and Clark's expedition to the western US, they looked at new routes. They sort of walked different places. They tried to explore where the rivers were or what sort of people they encountered. They probably got lost a little bit, but they kept these maps of where they'd been. It was pretty painstaking to keep track of these maps. Today, you just take your phone with the GPS on it. You basically know where you are at any time. It's not a big deal. But in computing, sort of, I think we try it, especially in an exploratory side of science, you know, looking at what's the next step. We often try a bunch of things out, and we don't know exactly where we're going sometimes. And keeping track of where we've been, what we've tried, is an important piece. So, you know, often we think about these pipelines of looking at data coming in, doing some computations on it, generating some results, looking at those results, hopefully getting some knowledge out of that, maybe going back, looking at other results. But in addition, we usually go back and do more programs, right? We submit more jobs. We explore what the computation is, as well as what the data, different data sets that we can look at, or different input parameters. And so this change in some of the exploratory tasks is kind of the norm. And so reasoning is kind of important in this process, right? You have to make decisions about where to go next. And that's something that usually scientists have to do. The computer can do broad surveys of trying different parameterizations and things like that, but really to change direction and look at the next step is something that requires this sort of reflective reasoning that Donald Norman talks about, where he talks about following chains of reasoning backward and forward, sometimes backtracking when a promising line of thought proves to be unfruitful. And so, you know, we sometimes need these external aids. We need some way to keep track of where we've been. And so this provenance fits into this idea here. So the word provenance comes from the art world. And it's meant to sort of show custody of a painting, right? So a Rembrandt, you can look at a Rembrandt, you can look at the stroke style, you can try to understand what's going on there, but one of the things that curators of art look at is actually where the painting's been, this lineage of when it was commissioned, who owned it after that, who they sold it for, and so on and so forth, how it eventually ended up in the National Gallery of Art. And this trace is important for verifying the authenticity of the piece of artwork. And provenance in science, you don't always hear it referred to as provenance. As I've said, you've all done some sort of provenance, no doubt, but keeping track of what computations you've done, what the lineage of the data is. And this information, like a page from a notebook Lederberg had on DNA recombination, includes things like the date, the raw data that he observed, annotations about that data. And so, these lab notebooks were around for years and years. They served to keep track of all of this information. People manually recorded it. But now with larger volumes of data, you're running huge computations. Keeping track of all of these things manually doesn't always scale. And further in computational science, you have things where you get your data, your parameters, you have computations, visualizations, eventually going to the papers. Being able to trace back from the figures that you have in your paper to the raw data requires keeping track of a lot of provenance information. And furthermore, I think there's been a trend, maybe a bit slower than some would like, but in the evolution of publication, right? We're not just publishing papers. People are publishing some of their code now. People are publishing computational experiments and tests. And sometimes not as much, maybe people are publishing the provenance, exactly what was run, right? What machine you ran it on, what times, if there are any failures in certain things. Keeping track of that sort of fine-grained provenance at times can be interesting to sort of analyze the exact specifications of why maybe an experiment that somebody tried to run later turned out a little differently, right? If you have some sort of non-determinism, like a random number, random seed or something that, if you're using a pseudo-random number generator, if you can keep track of that information, maybe you can try to reproduce. But if you use a different random seed the next time, you may be able to understand why the results slightly differ. And going back to this idea of the scientific papers and provenance-rich publications, this paper that I referenced on Galois conjugates was actually something that, when published, they published not only the figures, but also the workflows that went behind the figures that generated the figures. So you could actually click, with the right tools, click on the figure. It would load up, sort of with the right software, the workflow that went along with that figure, and you could test different parameterizations of this plot or look at different colorings or whatever you'd like to do to sort of change that figure. But you could sort of explore the data more than just staring at a static figure. And I think this is beneficial throughout not just publications, but in terms of keeping track of our experiments, in producing more knowledge, not just text. It allows you to sort of use what's out there already. Science can move faster, hopefully higher quality publications. If reviewers, like Aaron alluded to this morning, sort of being able to go and look at the code that's published and run it and try it out, we can test whether things are working, what the corner cases might be that you don't always see in the paper or aren't advertised by authors often. And so I think this idea of trying to keep track of what's going on with the data, what's going on with the computation is something that's very interesting. Okay, so that's sort of the scope of why I think provenance is important, and now I want to sort of go into some of the details about provenance, what it is, what it looks like, how do you store it. And so to begin, we can look at things like the dictionary definition, where we talk about the source and origin of an object, its history, its pedigree, this record of ultimate derivation. And I think there are sort of two focuses in provenance: the causality, trying to see the sequence of steps that determined the final output, as well as derivation, right? You may not care exactly about the steps, but you want to know that your results depended on this set of sensors that were sitting out in the middle of the ocean on this certain day or something like that, right? Being able to trace back to the raw data. And provenance itself is data. It's really a list of steps, the metadata, things about timings, when things occurred, who initiated it, notes about it, and it can be used to preserve information about experiments and to answer many questions. So we've heard about workflows in both of the last talks, so I'm not going to go too far, but I think this idea of abstraction that Michael touched on is important here, right? The goal of workflows is not necessarily to make the fastest thing. You could probably deconstruct workflows and make the low-level code run really, really fast. But the ability to look at a workflow at a higher level and understand it in Swift and other systems like this makes things a lot easier to understand when you come back to it and to sort of change things up, right? You don't have to spend a lot of time trying to understand every piece of the code. But it's basically these computational modules connected together. There's a data flow so that when data is ready, it can be input and used by the next modules downstream. So we go from some input data set, use some visualization processing in this workflow, for instance, to get an image out. And so a provenance graph for this might look like something very similar to what was shown in the workflow, except now we have arrows, actually, you can kind of tell, going up instead of down. And there are sort of a few more bubbles because all of the intermediate data is explicitly specified here. So in between each one of those connections in the workflow, there's data that's flowing along those connections. When we actually look at the provenance, when that workflow is actually run, you see where those intermediate data were generated. And so if we zoom in a little bit here, you can see the input file at the top. The structured data reader used that file. It generated a data set. The contour filter used that data set, and so on and so forth. And we can include timing information along with that. So what do we want to ask about provenance? We can maybe capture this information about what was run, who ran it, parameters that were used. Some of the questions we might ask are, what process led to the output image? What input data sets contributed to the output image? What workflows create an ISO surface with ISO value 57? So if you don't have just provenance for one workflow, but you've run 50, 100 different workflows, you can go back and look at the times when you've used a particular computational module or you've used a particular set of parameters. Who created the data product? When was the data file created? Why was a certain module used? And that why question is something you probably can't just figure out by looking at the provenance. It's something that somebody's going to have to manually annotate, right? There may be somebody that wants to say, I'm using this particular module for a reason. That's something that you might want to note before you start running a script. Or why do two output images differ? If you run the same workflow and you use some sort of non-deterministic process, you may get different answers. Why is that? Well, maybe you can trace that back to the non-determinism involved. Provenance can be generated from workflows. It can be generated from tasks, from programs, from scripts. The properties of provenance are usually related to the computational model. So if you have sort of a GUI application, the sort of provenance you get out of that is probably going to look a bit different than what you get from a command line script or from a workflow. But in all of these, there's sort of this idea of causality, knowing what data and steps influenced other data and steps, the dependencies between data, the data process dependencies, and the causality. So you can look at these graphs, and these used and was generated links tell you the circles indicating the data, the rectangles indicating the activities along the way. And as I alluded to earlier with some of the questions, some of this provenance is not anything that you can try to capture automatically. Right? Our goal would be to try to capture provenance automatically. If we know when we're running a program, we're telling it what parameters to use, why don't we just have our environment keep track of those parameters? We don't have to have that as something that I'm going to manually record in a notebook. But there are things where we want to know specific user-defined information. So annotations offer this availability, and so a lot of provenance solutions have the ability to add in notes like you would in the margins of a lab notebook. So what's needed to capture, store, and use provenance? I think it comes down to sort of three key pieces. One is a way to capture that provenance. If we're doing something automatically, how do you capture the provenance information? The second is a model for representing the provenance, right? If we want to ask queries, if we want to look at that provenance in the future, we need to have some way to understand it. As tools to store, to query, to analyze that provenance information. So looking at provenance capture mechanisms, this is from a 2008 survey, but I think the general idea still holds here. There's workflow-based provenance capture. This tends to be sort of a higher level because you have the abstraction of the computational modules in the workflow. You have things that can be process-based, fairly similar to the workflow-based, and then things that try to sit sort of below the surface at the system level, looking at the OS or the file system, tracking modifications, when something was, an API call was done on a system, or when the certain files were accessed. You can keep track of that sort of information. The trade-off here is the workflow and processes tend to abstract things a little better. Things at the OS level are capturing sort of every line of a script that ran. You have to sort of go through that and try to understand and build back the abstraction of what was going on, right? You can make a ton of different calls when you're opening shared libraries or other sorts of code, other sorts of libraries behind the scenes. All of that might be captured by sort of this agnostic file system capturing provenance, but you then, when you want to understand that later on, have to digest that, make sense of it. What's really important here? What do we need to keep track of? Another piece that goes into the equation with provenance is the granularity, right? I talked about workflows having this more abstract level, nicer way of thinking about things. That may be sort of a coarser provenance, right? If I say this program ran with inputs X, Y, and Z, it produced outputs A, B, and C, you know, that tells me how the program ran, what the inputs and outputs are. That's some general usable information. But if I go to a fine-grained level, I may get things like input X was read into register 4, Y was read into register 5, an add operation was used using registers 4 and 5, and you can get, you know, even more fine-grained and fine-grained. But at some point, how fine-grained do you want to be, right? You're gonna get more information, but you have storage concerns. If you're gonna write out all this information while you're doing some processing, that's certainly a performance concern. You know, there have been stories where people have more provenance than the data that they're actually analyzing or outputting. And so the question is, you know, for large projects, you can't keep track of all that data. You can't expect to keep track of it. So I think abstraction can help here, and to give, you know, I've talked about workflows already, but you can see sort of a script here, how that's represented as a workflow with parameters controlling some of those pieces of the workflows. But furthermore, we can go to maybe an abstract workflow where this is sort of even higher level. We're not talking about specific VTK modules now. We're looking at things like read file, extract isosurface, render visualization. That's sort of the high level view if I want to explain to, you know, just some, you know, general computer scientist, general computational scientist. That might mean something, or at least at some level just to most people, right? And if I look at the provenance that corresponds to these things, the VTK version, the workflow version, is on the left, the one with the script. If I were to sort of keep track of every parameter that's involved with the script, every line of the script would be even greater. But the abstract view is something that I can sort of start to digest. You know, okay, I have an input file that reads in the file, gives me a data set, extract an isosurface from that, and I get an image out from that, right? That's something that's at a level that I can start to understand a bit better. So abstraction is important here. This idea of granularity is a concern when thinking about what do you want to store with provenance. Another piece is how are you going to store it? You know, if you keep track of provenance for every data item, when you're doing some sort of thing that's in a loop, or you're doing the same thing over again for just a different piece of the data, you get a lot of repetition, right? It's the same process going on and on. Do I need to record that over and over again? Is there a way to deal with that? If you do some sort of nested data storage, or if you have some sort of factorization techniques, you can get away, or you can help to reduce the storage costs here. But the idea of repeated provenance is not uncommon, right? Even if you're not just, you know, keeping track of the same thing over and over again, you may have the same computation, but you just change one parameter. The provenance for those runs may look very similar, even though the dates are slightly different. The parameters, the outputs might be a little bit different. The same general path is going to be followed. The graph structure of that provenance is going to be similar. And then, you know, you may also have things where you create a new computation, but it has a similar structure to something somebody ran 2 weeks ago. You may be able to use some techniques to factor that out. In terms of storing formats, provenance can be stored as files in terms of XML or RDF files. There's been some work to store provenance in sort of relational databases and things like that. The main thing with provenance is if you want to do these queries where you trace back from sort of an output data to an input data, you have to sort of visit all these different nodes along a graph. And so something like that, there's some support in relational databases for that, but things like graph databases or RDF are sort of a bit more optimized for doing some of those reachability queries. So that's one thing to keep in mind in terms of if you want to do a lot of queries and understand things, what the sort of storage format might be. Another piece that fits into the idea of storage is layering provenance, right? So we heard sort of about some abstract workflows or thinking about this is the way it's specified, this is the way it's actually implemented when we go out to a grid or to a supercomputer, how it's actually divvied up and run. You can think about workflow instances, workflow templates, going to the executable workflow, and then keeping track of some execution log. And different workflow systems or other sorts of systems have different ways of doing this. But you may not have to store the workflow specification over and over again if you're just running, you have a repetitive task that you're going to run every day. Just keep that workflow specification once and only record what the changes are when you run it each time. That specific information. So just a normalization like you might see in other, in database, sort of database technology. Okay, so that's sort of provenance, capturing it, storing it. In terms of thinking about provenance, modeling it, PROV is a W3 standard finalized in 2013, I think, that has sort of, the community sort of settled on in terms of a way to store provenance of many different things. And one of the key things is it just sort of wants to model the objects involved, keep track of their relationships, and focus on sort of interoperability because, you know, it would be great if everybody could do all of their work in, you know, a standard workflow environment or a standard scripting environment, and we could just have an optimized provenance capture there. But provenance can come from a lot of different sources. You're going to use different tools. You may have provenance that's captured from things like sensors, you know, capturing data out in the ocean or something like that. That's not something that's going to fit into sort of your closed contained system. So having this interoperability, a format where everybody can write out to sort of a standard way and talk back and forth, link up the chains of provenance for when data is manipulated in different cases. One thing that comes into the idea of provenance modeling is prospective and retrospective provenance. The idea being prospective provenance, just sort of a recipe for what I expect to do, the workflow, the script, the code that's behind things, and retrospective provenance, the things that, you know, are specific to an execution. So you don't need prospective provenance, but it's often useful to help inform the retrospective provenance. Retrospective provenance keeps the same type of information as the prospective provenance, plus a bit more. And you can have multiple times you run a workflow or run a set of code, so you can have multiple retrospective provenance traces for one prospective provenance listing. So an example that's sort of was tossed about when some of this modeling was being developed was totally not computational at all, was thinking about baking a cake, right? If you go and look at a recipe for baking a cake, there's a set of instructions. Gather the ingredients, preheat the oven, grease the cake pan, mix the ingredients, mix the dry ingredients, add the mixtures together, pour the batter into the cake pan, put the pan in the oven, take the cake out of the oven, and hopefully you get this lovely looking cake, right? And then you go and try it, and there's a lot of other things that go on in between, and you may not get out the cake you wanted. You know, you may have had to go to the store to buy butter. You didn't have butter. Recipe called for butter, so you need to go do that. You may have goofed, and instead of adding 3/4 of a cup of flour, you poured a little extra in, and there was a cup of flour. Instead of greasing the cake pan before gathering the ingredients, you greased it after. That may not be a big deal. You added the wet mixture into the dry mixture instead of vice versa. You baked it for a little bit different time. You let it cool for a certain amount of time that wasn't specified, right? So this retrospective provenance includes sort of exactly what was done, not just the recipe for what you think should have been done. And this is sort of an important distinction between I saved the code, I can just rerun it, and things will be fine. I'll be able to reproduce it. And okay, what did I actually do? What were the parameters behind the scenes? What was the actual data file I used? Okay, I know it was called this, but I may have rewritten that data file 2 years ago before, you know, after I ran this test, right? And so keeping track of more information about what exactly happened is what this retrospective side of provenance is focused on. So prospective provenance, sort of a recipe. Retrospective provenance, what actually happened when you tried to follow that recipe? And so I talked about PROV being a W3C standard now. The community kind of organized some provenance challenges. The end of the 2006 to 2009. First provenance challenge just sought to see people that were doing provenance, what sort of systems they have, what sort of queries they could do. And then the second provenance challenge feeding off the first provenance challenge, kind of looked at interoperability. What, if we want to talk about provenance between different systems, how do we do that? And that led to the development of something called the open provenance model, which really was a precursor to the PROV recommendation. Fun thing is they changed the naming from OPM to PROV, so I don't want to talk a lot about OPM. Some of you may have seen it, but because the name's changed, I don't want to rehash that. The focus really is on the model and sort of what's involved, not necessarily the formats. Okay, so the three key classes in PROV are entities, activities, and agents. Entities and activities are sort of the nouns and the verbs. So it's a thing, an entity, it's something that's physical or digital or conceptual. And the activity is something that occurs over a period of time and acts upon or with entities. And then there's a third piece that helps answer the who questions that we have with provenance, right? If there's an agent, maybe a person, it may be something computational, some scheduler, something that takes the form of responsibility for an activity taking place, we can start talking about agents there. But entities and activities are sort of the key things that I tend to deal with when looking at some of the data provenance. But the nice thing about these three things is you can think about three views of provenance with them. So if you just live in the entity world, right, you can talk about things of was derived from. So these are just, here's my output data, it depended on this input data, those data depended on this other input data, and you can draw these graphs of just the data dependencies. Nothing about what the computations done were. And that's really the data flow view. A process flow view would be to just look at the activities and look at was informed by. So this process ran, then this process ran, sort of irrespective of what they actually did, what they generated. And when you combine those two, you get this sort of causality derivation view where you see the interplay between activities and entities. If you just look at agents, that's really the responsibility view. Who did this? What was responsible for causing this action or this piece of computation to occur? So the derivation edges was generated by and used are sort of the key ones there. So was generated by goes from an entity, from a noun, to an activity, a verb, and used goes in the other direction. So in this case, the compose activity used two data sets, used a data set and then a region list, and then that generated the composition one there. Right? So, and the arrows always point back to sort of what was used by or was generated by. So where workflows would tend to draw those arrows in the reverse direction, provenance graphs, you're sort of drawing them backwards. And if you're just dealing with data derivation, you can draw graphs with just entities and was derived from edges to keep track of that information. So there's a lot more things to PROV. There's a whole standard and a primer online at the W3C that you can go look at. There's a link later in the slides about this. But one interesting thing that comes out of this is you can kind of have different views of who looks at the provenance at certain times. Things like, okay, here's the blogger's provenance data. They quoted from an article. There's not a lot of provenance there, but if you look further down, there's provenance from the newspaper that quoted them. They relied on government agencies' provenance data. That relied on some chart-generated provenance data, right? And so you could sort of peel back all these different layers, some of which may be in the same system, some of which may be in totally different systems and was captured in different ways. But the idea with PROV is to sort of provide this standard for interoperating provenance that's gathered from different sources, computational or non-computational. So how do you deal with this data? What do you do with this data? You really rely on some sort of query method, right? Unless you want to scroll through tons and tons of text, you need some ways to talk about what provenance is there. And these are kind of tied to the storage backends. So if you have relational, you might use some sort of a language that sits on top of SQL. If you have some RDF, you can use things like Sparkle, XML, XQuery, other technologies along those lines. There's also some work looking at sort of more graphical depictions. So back to the same querying example. If I want to talk about, input data sets that led to a particular image and also used a particular set of parameters. How could I write that query, right? I need these sort of dependency edges. And there are ways to express that in database languages or other RDF languages. But you could also think about drawing these things and querying provenance by example. So representing provenance as graphs, and then querying by using that sort of graph template to see what provenance graphs match that graph, sort of a subgraph type query. Another piece of the querying, of provenance querying and making use of the provenance is actually having links to the data or knowing where your data sits. So one of the talks yesterday talked about having a data warehouse, right, where whatever you did sort of went and talked to the data warehouse, checked in checked out the input data and checked in the output data. And so that sort of a thing of having some repository or some way to deal with what the data is important, because if I look at some of these provenance traces like the one on the left, I stored that somewhere on my laptop. This was just an exploratory data study of my some of the data that I have, and that file wasn't found later on, right? 2 years down the road, I moved that file, I changed computers, I wrote over that file with some other file. Like, how do I keep track of the fact that, okay, I wrote down in my provenance that I used this specific file or I used this specific data source, but I can't necessarily go back to that each time. And so if you have curated data stores, you alleviate this. But if you have exploratory tasks where you're just reading in data on your own personal machine, you might need other ways of doing this. So if you have some way to manage the store that associates the data with the computation, that links the provenance to the data associated with that provenance, you can do queries like this, where I have some file that's sitting on my hard disk, or my disk. And then I can look at the contents of that file. I can hash the contents. I can query a file store for where that may be. That may be a file store that's local to my computer. That may be something where I'm going out to the network. And once I get a reference to that file, I can query the provenance. I can look at where it was used. And I can look at the inputs, right? Use that derivation history to look at the input references there. Query the file store again to get back those input files. And if I do something with like a version store like Git, I can go back and retrieve the actual versions of those files that were used when I ran that computation 2 months ago or 2 years ago. Because I have sort of these tags, these hashes that inform me about the content of the data, not just some file name that it might be in the script or the code that I have. This is a slide from a survey on some of the computational provenance, showing, back in 2008, some of the capture mechanisms for some of the systems that were out there at the time, what sort of retrospective or prospective provenance they captured. We'll talk a little bit about workflow evolution, storage types, what the query support was. There are more things out there now. So we heard about Galaxy as another workflow system that captures provenance. There's Sumatra, another provenance capturing solution. IPython Notebook, being able to keep track of code that way is another thing that's sort of provenance enabled, right? You're not losing these scripts that you run. And so that's another piece. That's another sort of provenance-enabled system. Maybe not to the level of some of the other systems, but it's used by a lot of people now. And there's a lot more, too. I'm sure I'm leaving out tens of other systems. One that I want to talk about a little bit, because it gets on another piece of provenance, is Vis Trails, which is a system that I've worked on for a few years now. And one of the focuses of that system was on this exploratory task side of things, right? So not workflows that run over and over again, but a workflow that I'm going to change a little bit, try on a different data set, try different parameters, keeping track of all those changes. And so streamlining this exploration is one of the things that Vis Trails has looked at. Building tools that are sort of usable tools for scientists. It's something you can look at it on GitHub, PyPy. We have an Anaconda package you can access through Binstar. And yeah, I kind of like Anaconda as well. It sort of manages a lot of the dependencies for things like Vis Trails and other larger systems, so that you don't have to worry as much about that. And it's seen some interesting applications in different disciplines and countries, different science applications. And again, showing some examples of workflows here. Here's an example of sort of exploring some data from the subway system in New York City. So I have some different workflows of reading in that data from the web, parsing it, showing it as a table. There are parameters behind these workflows. I can do things like join that information, the CSV file, with some JSON files, some other web-based files to get out more information. And I can draw figures that have parameters about how those figures were generated as well. So it's not just sort of the computational pieces. I can record provenance about, why my figure looks the way it is, things like labels as well. And so Vis Trails captures execution provenance like we've seen in the PROV format. It has sort of a graphical display of what's going on there in terms of this workflow was executed, what time it was executed, some codes for how things were executed in this case. So again, this kind of looks like a workflow, but the coloring and some of the notes on the side tell us a little bit more. So the coloring tells us whether we had those results cached. If it was a deterministic computation, we can cache some of the previous results from previous explorations, previous executions, and so we don't need to rerun them again if we can keep them in memory or keep them on disk. Things that are green were successfully run. If there are things that are colored in red, that shows that there was an error occurred. You can look at information about what the error occurred would be. So this is this retrospective in provenance for executions. But on the exploration side, one of the things that Vis Trails tries to do is keep track of what we call workflow evolution provenance. So there are all these workflows that we might develop, and if it is an exploratory project, what we might look at is, reading in that data as a table and then generating a visualization of it after we looked at the table, tried to understand what was going on with the raw data, right? You don't want to scroll through a table. Why can't I generate a visualization of it? So I generate these different workflows. They correspond to specific results, specific retrospective provenance traces. But along the way, what I'm keeping track of is the changes to the workflows. So this is on the prospective side of provenance, right? This is as I create workflows, as I create the recipes, what's going on. And so the blue and orange here indicate what occurs in one workflow that doesn't occur in the other workflow. So the orange computational models occur in the first workflow, and then I changed a few things when I went to that blue workflow. So there are these actual actions that occur, actions on the workflow itself. And because we're using a workflow, because we're in this environment that we kind of control, this Vis Trails environment, we can keep track of what the changes are as somebody edits a workflow. And so I can look at something called workflow evolution provenance, which is not the changes to the data that I'm actually running, but data as workflows here. So these are my two workflows, and what happened to get from one workflow to the other was I deleted some modules, I added some other modules, I changed some parameters. That's what happened along the way. And so this workflow evolution provenance is capturing the prospective provenance, these changes in the recipes that I run. So that not only do I keep track of what ran, when it ran, who ran it, but also how I change things along the way, or how multiple users change things along the way. And as I talked about, there are this provenance doesn't always occur in these closed systems. You might want to provenance enable something like ParaView, and can we have this same sort of execution provenance or evolution provenance or retrospective provenance? Can we hook into sort of the API calls behind the scenes in ParaView or other tools like that and look at how a data set was explored and something like that? And so it's, the same sort of version tree or evolution provenance that shows up on the workflow side is something that could show up in a tool like ParaView in sort of a separate window here. So you get a list of changes here. Again, somebody had to decide how to do this, and ParaView makes it kind of easy because each action that's pushed onto the undo stack can sort of be triggered and captured in a serialized form that we just push out to the provenance data here. And we can look at it in different ways too, right? So looking at something that's visual like ParaView might be easier to scroll through a list of the visualizations that you generate to identify a particular time or a particular version that you want to go back to, rather than trying to understand a graph or a tree like I showed earlier. And so, all this stuff is still kind of just keeping track of what the provenance was. And so one of the things I talked about with provenance is, can we do more with provenance? Can we use the provenance? Can we reuse provenance? Can we use it for more exploration? And so couple of the things that I worked on in terms of looking at visualization pipelines, trying to learn from those, is if you think about building a visualization pipeline, if you've dealt with VTK or other things, to create some, well, it's not a really simple visualization, but it's something showing the visible, the head from the Visible Human project here, different cuts of that. You know, there's a lot of modules that go into that. And so trying to start and trying to figure out how you take a data set and get this sort of nice visualization out of it can take a while. And furthermore, if you look at VTK or other complicated tool sets, there's often a lot of things that you could choose to use. And if you don't know where to start, you're looking up documentation, looking up examples. And it may be possible to use sort of a technique that is pretty ubiquitous in the web world now, right? Completions. You start typing a search term, you start typing a URL, you expect to see some suggestions of how it should complete. Even if you misspell things, it'll correct that now, right? And it just uses the data that's out there, data that it knows, corpuses of words, corpuses of past history of websites and things like that. And so if we could use provenance to do something similar, like what are the computations that I ran? What are the visualizations that I generated? Can we do this same sort of pipeline completion or you know, suggest new computations from the old computations? So take a database of pipelines, take a database of provenance, and try to learn from that some of the things that appear a lot, right? The same types of computations happening over and over again, the same workflow structures. Can we pull those out and do something like that? And you know, allow a user to sort of navigate through, and in a similar way to having completions pop up in a web browser, you can sort of think about this, doing this in an interface, in this case inside of Vis Trails. And then, you know, another piece of this might be not just from the start taking a certain module and trying to suggest what might complete a pipeline, but if I know I made some change from one output to another output, can I sort of tell this system to do the same sort of change based on the fact that I know this evolution provenance? I know how a workflow is changed in a certain way, so the actions of deleting modules, changing parameters. And you know, it may not be the exact same workflow. It may be something that's slightly different, but I may still be able to apply the same type of actions to that with a little bit of insight, right? So these workflows here these outputs have workflows behind the scenes here. And so if I look at the workflows in the top, I can sort of see a correlation for what happened there. And then in the bottom, I can try to make that same change from the left side to the right side. And so, you know, this is called analogies. Similar to your SAT analogies, A is to B, as C is to, you fill that in based on the relationship to A and B. And the relationship from A and B is determined by looking at that difference between the first two workflows, which we have from the evolution provenance. But if we just blindly apply that, that's not always a valid workflow, right? It may be that I'm using different modules or different things, but maybe I can try to find a map between what appears in A and what appears in C, and then apply the actions to C based on the map, based on mapping them through, based on using that map, right, to get out what I expect to see from the analogy. And it doesn't always work. It's something that, you know, we can, but it's another example of trying to use provenance to do more for you, right? It's not just taking provenance, putting it on, you know, keeping track of exactly what I did, putting it on a shelf, and then if somebody comes to me and saying, how did you get this result? I pull that book, you know, that file cabinet out and say, go ahead, look, try to figure out what's going on. It's trying to make use of this provenance for your own work or for other people's work. Okay, and this sort of ties into a vision of provenance-rich science, of using provenance all the way through and capturing that from the raw data through the provenance, or through the published papers, excuse me. And there's, you know, been some work on also using provenance for teaching. So, you know, if you have students turn in an assignment with, you know, certain visualizations that they've done, or if you try to post lecture slides with, you know, sort of static pictures, it's the same idea as publishing those in papers, right? If a student can click on an example or look at an example and interact with that, it's going to be a lot more useful than trying to just put up the static step-by-step directions often. And if you ask students to turn in homework assignments, you can try to learn from that as well, right? See where people got confused, why they got confused, what steps maybe led them off course. So this idea of having the provenance of, not just the homework assignment, it's the show your work with the homework assignment. And you can do that in the computational setting with provenance. So you can do things like look at, for assignments, when are people doing their work? Well, most of them do it near the deadline. Or if you want to look at two different projects, so here these are sort of the workflow evolution trees for two different students. One of them sort of tried a dartboard approach, try every sort of a thing that happens and see if one of them works out. Another student seemed like maybe they understood what their goal was and followed more of a linear path. Okay, so what I've tried to sort of take you on in this tour of provenance is not only motivating it with the idea of trust for sort of ensuring the quality and reproducibility of results, but also trying to show why provenance can be important for reuse, for effective exploration. What I want you to get out of this talk is just a respect for provenance and an understanding for why it's important to keep track of what you've done in the past and why it can be useful. And the fact that keeping track of it manually isn't always fun, right? If you can find some ways, some tools out there to keep track of those things, like the history mechanism in Bash, that's a provenance mechanism in itself. But keeping track of that stuff is something that it's good to be aware of. When you're looking at provenance, consider what needs to be stored. What really needs to be stored if I want to reproduce this? What would be nice to store? What do I really not need to store? And sometimes that, an interesting story here is I talked to somebody who said, I can rerun this simulation over and over again. I don't want to store the results each time I do it. But if you can tell me, exactly what I ran and sort of some analysis of those results, I'll save that out. If I need to really go back and look at the intermediate data, I'll just rerun it, right? So maybe you don't even need to store the output data or the intermediate output data, at least, if you store the provenance and can effectively recreate that computation in the future if you need to. Abstraction helps with provenance, right? If you can specify something in a workflow, or if you can abstract your code into different functions, it'll be a lot easier to think about how you want to store the provenance there. The PROV model helps organize, connecting a variety of provenance. And if nothing else, remember provenance isn't just for keeping a paper trail, right? It's not just for when somebody comes to you and says, I don't believe your results. You better show me your data, how you got there, or else, right? Hopefully it's something that you do as something that's a positive influence, right? So that you can go back and understand what you did in the past and extend that to new results. There are a few references here. You can get them from the slides. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
So I think that the external dependencies piece of this is probably at least one of the hardest, if not the hardest part of it. Are there any sort of OS level things that can help in terms of which libraries were installed when and what versions, how they were built, those sorts of things?
Yeah, so something I didn't mention is virtual machines, right? You could just do all your code in a VM. Hopefully then you archive that and then that sits there. Problem is if you're running on a certain type of environment and you want to move to a better environment, how do you migrate that? There's been some good work on trying to sort of decouple the VM so that it can make use of the latest hardware and stuff like that. So I think there is promise in that direction. But yeah, how often do you want to store a VM out? Can you do smart storage of those things? Maybe, but some of it is, if you take an abstract workflow, if you can keep track of that information and you can give that to somebody, that may be more useful than sometimes keeping track of all the information that's in the VM if you don't know what to do with that VM, right? So there's sort of this balance between, can I document something or can I give you everything that I have at sort of this OS level provenance? But there are solutions to get at the OS level provenance, and I think they can be effective in some situations.
For our particular purpose, we went to great lengths to be able to, in fact, to be able to store the code itself into the output files, so that given the output file, anybody can unzip it from the store and recreate the entire thing. But it ended up into a terrible mess of code because what had happened was it was not a checkout or a commit that we wanted in the source, but it had to read the entire directory from where the source had to come in and zip it in somewhere and push it in. So if you want to do something like that, is there a way to do it? A decent way to do it?
So you want to store the code actually in the file?
Yes.
That's
in the
sort of
output file where it is.
I mean,
Right now we are storing the config completely in every output file that we get as a time series. We have the configuration which was given as the input as a part of it. But originally we had thought that we should put in even the source code.
so why can't you reference sort of a version control repository for that?
Because a person might not commit before running the code.
Could you force them to, or create sort of a
That would
repository?
be very big.
I mean, so
Usually at the last moment you make some small changes to the code and then you.
yeah, and you know this. I alluded to this earlier with files.
And then there is a problem of running on supercomputers where some of the Git things might not be available.
But for this exploratory case, this is actually something where you run the workflow. If we see a data file that's changed, we just check it in with this solution for this work here, with this persistence work. What we actually did is, if you're in a, we controlled the workflow environment, so it's not the same setting. But we just saw you changed a file. We'll check in that version, because if you're going to run it and generate an output, we should probably keep track of that, at least in some settings. And so,
No, the problem is sometimes what happens is you run a part of the code and then you come up with some solution, use that as an input file, change some part of the code, and then you continue again. That becomes messy.
so like in the middle of you have a time series, and like you're changing it as you're evaluating different pieces.
Time with a lot of dissipation so that we get a decent initial file for the more accurate part. So that is a part of, that is not illegal to do it.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about it more offline. But yeah, it's an interesting. I haven't heard of people storing. Well, I think there are a couple of things of people storing the code in the output file, but that's one way to make sure they don't get separated. So, yep.
Curious if you've heard of people using AWS AMIs as a sort of provenance for storing their code.
AWS, what was the
Amazon Machine
Yes.
Instances.
Okay, I have not, but it would be interesting to look into.
I was wondering if you are aware of any tool that. So a typical workflow is that you have some pre-processing tools, some production tools, and some post-processing tools. Have you heard of any tool or any library that can simply track your inputs, outputs, and log it? So I heard of one, but one of my collaborators has done something, but he never finalized it. So the way this worked is that it was a small library that was tracking every input output, hash it, take the versions of every executable, every program, hash the input files, and if you didn't have an external command, then actually he could roll back the entire thing, and from a single output file, it could tell whether this input file which input file was used for a certain output file.
Yeah.
Have you heard of anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of similar along the lines here of sort of going from some output file. If you have the file store, if you have the provenance, all in, hopefully in the same setting, you can get back to the input files. I've heard things along those lines, but nothing comes to mind immediately for that case that you're talking about. But it is something that I think could be useful. At the OS level, yeah, PASS is definitely one.
I didn't mean OS level, I meant program specific. You have an application with its own pre- and post-processing tools, and then you link against the library, and then you create a local working directory or project directory, local storage of all these steps.
Sort of like a virtual environment.
Like a bash history for the project. Like a my project history with each and every input hashed.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like some of the virtual environment stuff. Sumatra is another one that kind of sounds similar to what was going on, or what you're trying to describe. But yeah, I don't know of the others off the top of my head right now.